work with Jews. And he put up his hand and he said, "Don't worry." And he stretched out a map and he said, "Look, over here there's a small town called Bergen. And on the other side there's a little village called Belsen. And between Bergen and Belsen there's a concentration camp. And it's about to be liberated. And that's where you're going." Now, I am forever grateful that I did not get to Bergen-Belsen on the day it was liberated. But this story is told to me by the man who was in charge of liberating the camp. And it goes like this. People were in blocks in the camp. And there was a woman named Mrs. Zeidner who had two little girls, one Paula and one Bella. And Paula was about 5 and she was very sick, close to dying. And Bella was about 9 and was somewhat better off. And there were almost no rations given to people at the end when they saw that they were really going to be defeated, the Germans. And the people in L5 would say to Mrs. Zeidner, "Don't break up the piece of bread and give it to both your kids. Obviously one of them is going to die. Just give it to the big one and at least you'll have one child to take out of the camp with you." Well, a mother doesn't do that, so she broke the bread in half and gave a piece to Paula and a piece to Bella. And when Colonel Glenn Hughes came to the gates of Bergen-Belsen and opened it, and he saw the death and the destruction and the dying, he said, "I did not know where to begin." And then he saw a woman with a little child running towards him. And he was a doctor, actually a pediatrician. And he said there was a mother with a sick child in her hand, and she handed the child to me, and I knew what to do. It was identified right early on in Bergen-Belsen, in the early few weeks, that there were approximately 83 children ranging in age from about 9 to 15 who had absolutely no adult supervision whatsoever. And so when I arrived there, it was decided that we would start a children's home. We set up a home for these 83 children, and the first day we distributed blankets to everybody. It was fairly warm, it was spring by then, 1 blanket apiece. And I went home, or to where we stayed outside Bergen-Belsen into Coleman's Gasthof. And when I went back the next morning, I was told that there were no more blankets in the children's house. I said, "What happened?" They said they sold them to the Germans, every single blanket. Well, I realized there was an awful lot about Bergen-Belsen children that I did not know. So I called them together and I said, "Listen, I'm giving you one more issue of blankets. You sell them, you're on your own." But soon they settled down and they behaved like children. They had their fights, they had their cliques, they acted out. The teenagers had their puppy loves, and many of the smaller children cried themselves to sleep at night. It was at that time that I got a call from Berlin. They said, "We have an orphanage here and it's closing. We have 5 children that were children of Jewish mothers and SS fathers. We don't know what to do with them." I said, "Just hang in there, we'll come and get them." So we went to Berlin and we picked up these children. There were 5, they were adorable. They were a little bit younger than most of our Bergen-Belsen children. And they came we brought them back home. And on that day, my fiance had come from the south of France where he was stationed at the American University. And he brought his Jeep into the Kinderheim. And he left it there for about 20 minutes, which was 20 minutes too long, because the minute he got back there, he went in and his camera had been stolen by one of our children. Bergen-Belsen children were very, very talented. Anyway, he came in and he helped to bathe those little Berlin children and put them to bed. And I looked at him and I said, "You know what? He's good husband material. He's a keeper." And I decided there and then that indeed I would marry him. Anyway, Paula and Bella were in our children's home because their mother had typhus. And there was a big raw one afternoon, and when we went outside, there was a man who had just come from Poland, and it was Paula and Bella's father. And there was such jubilation. Everybody was so pleased. I have to tell you, it was the only intact family I ever knew in Bergen-Belsen. So it was the best of days, and it was the worst of days, because here was Paula and Bella, who had a mother and a father, and 82 and 81 other children who knew they would never see their parents alive. There was one other father that came to Bergen a few weeks later, and that was Otto Frank. He came in search of Anne Frank, but by the time he got to our house, he knew, because he had been told, that Anne Frank had died. She had died only a few weeks before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. But she left behind her an incredible legend. You need to know that there have been more copies of the Diary of Anne Frank sold in the world than any other published book, with the exception of the Bible. Now, our kids were tremendously resourceful, and there was a marvelous group of actors in Bergen-Belsen who belonged to the famous Habima theatre in Poland. And they used to put on absolutely tremendous shows, and our kids would go every night. That was their entertainment. And one day they decided they would put on a show only for the military. But our kids said to us, listen, because they had asked me to be the MC. I spoke good Yiddish and I spoke good English. And they asked me to be the MC, and the kids said, well, you belong to us, and if you're going to be the MC, we ought to be able to go. And I said, I'm sorry, you can't. It's just for the military. Well, they begged and begged, and I said, absolutely not. Well, I get to the show, and I stand up, and in Yiddish and English, I say, good evening, and there's a roar of applause. I thought, well, what have I done? I've only said hello. And I started all over again. I said, hello, and the applause started all over again. And I looked down, and every single child in Bergen-Belsen was sitting in the front rows. They were the most resourceful of children. It was a wonderful night, and at the end of the show, the theatre group got up and they sang, "Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg." Do not ever say that you are on the last road, and some of the children began to cry. And then they sang it in English, do not ever say that you are on the last road, and some of the military began to cry. And I don't think of Bergen-Belsen often, but whenever I hear that song, I am undone. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst am letzten Weg. Do not ever say that you are on the last road. Now, we had formed a school in Bergen-Belsen, which gave us special new problems. We had to get the kids up in the morning to go to school, and we had our truants, but the school persisted and did the best it could. And suddenly we noticed that there were several men in uniform who were attending that school. And as we got closer to them, we were told that they were men from the Palestinian Brigade who were not yet sent back to Palestine, so they thought they would come into Bergen-Belsen to help, and help they did. Now, we were billeted in Coleman's Gasthof, just outside Bergen-Belsen, the same Coleman's Gasthof that was in charge, that gave billets to the SS who were running the camp. And we had our 5 trucks in the yard, quite close to very close to the camp. And the Palestinian Brigade parked their trucks in our yard at the same time. And they said, one day the head of the Palestinian group came to see us, and he said, look, I know you think we've come to work in the schools, and we're happy to do that, But we've actually come to start illegal immigration to bring adults out of the camp across to France, across to Marseille, and on illegal ships to Palestine. And we need your help, especially the women. We think if when our drivers go, there's a woman in the truck, we'll be able to get through more easily. And I spoke up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do that. We're here by the courtesy of the British government, and they've been very good to us, and we really can't, do that. And he looked at me quietly and he said, look, Sadie, whether you help us or not, we're going to do it. And I said, well, maybe we'll help you as long as you don't take the children. He said, absolutely, we will not take the children. It's far too dangerous. And so we worked all day, and at night, several nights, we took trips with the Palestinian Brigade to Marseille, putting Jews on the boats, and many of them got pretty safely to Palestine. Some of them were even on the Exodus. And as a matter of fact, one day one of our 17-year-olds was missing. When I went to find him, I was told that he had gone on one of the trips. As I said, they were pretty chutzpah kids. Now, Vishnak had promised that he wouldn't take the children, but I was worried about the kids. The camp life was no life for them. They really needed to be on kibbutzim or with families. So I was absolutely delighted when the British informed us that they would take our 83 children to London and they would give them certificates to go to Palestine. You may remember that in those days, if you were in Britain, you couldn't just go to Palestine. You needed to get certificates, and they were not offered, they were not given out so easily. So I thought, nevertheless, this was a terrific idea, and I readied my children to go, and they were delighted at the thought of going. But Yossel Rosensaft, who was the titular Jewish head of the Jewish community in Bergen-Belsen, came and he said, Sadie, stop. You can't take those children. They're not your children. They are children who have to go to Palestine, and we don't trust the British further than we can see them, and they cannot go. And I begged him, I said, Yossel, it'll be okay, but they can't stay forever in the camps. He refused to let them go, and he and I fought all night long. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I got a telephone call from Major Murphy, who ran the camp, and he asked me to come down. And I walked down to his office, and I went inside, and there were two men sitting there. Major Murphy, whom I knew quite well, and another man whom I knew not at all. And the other man said to me, what is your name? And I said, my name is Sadie Rucker. And he said, well, Sadie Rucker, how old are you? And I said, I'm 22. He said, yes, but you're a little too young, that the problems of the Jewish people should be sitting on your shoulders. So I came, and I realized that that was David Ben-Gurion. And he was able to convince Yossel Rosensaft that indeed, yes, the children could go to England, and he would be responsible for making sure the British government kept their word. And so my children boarded a plane in Celle Airport, and my year in Bergen-Belsen was over. Before I get to the end of the story, I want to tell you two stories which are not related to the children, but I think you will enjoy. Sometime after I had been in Bergen-Belsen for about 6 months, I wanted to go home because my father was very sick. And so I went to Celle Airport, and I asked if there was a plane going to London, and they said, yes, there's one leaving in an hour. And I get on this plane, and it's a little tiny Anson and 3 other officers on board, and there's a seat for me. And they started the plane, and we crossed to London. I had never been so sick in my entire life. I think the men in that plane were sorry they ever set eyes on me. I stayed in London for 2 days. Unfortunately, my brother was there. My brother was a squadron leader in the RAF. And he took me back to Gatwick Airport, which in those days was a little tiny airport. And I said to him, Ralph, I cannot go back in one of those small Anson planes. I was so ill coming over. And he said, let me see what I can do. So he went away for about half an hour and he came back and he said, do I have a plane for you? He said, Eisenhower has just come in from SHAEF headquarters with his private plane, and it's going back empty with 14 staff, and you are going to be on that plane. So I came over in Little Anson and I went back in Eisenhower's plane. There's one other story worth the telling. I wanted to go to the south of France, to Biarritz, to see my husband, and after about 9 months I decided I could take 2 days off to do that. The people on my unit were very worried that I was going to go through Germany, through Holland, into France, and to the south of France by myself, and they really didn't know what to do. So we were second lieutenants in the army, so we carried 2 little braids to indicate our rank. So jokingly, the head of the unit put 3 more pieces of braid on my epaulette, so now I had 5 pieces of braid. And I went through Holland and Germany, and I arrived in Paris, and I got on a train. I think I was the only, it was all full of military. I think I was the only person on that plane, on that train, that was a woman. And I said to the person in charge, look, I've been working very hard, and I wonder if you could find me a berth. And he said, I'm sorry, madam, but we have no more berths left. And he went away. He said, I'll get you a seat. A few minutes later, he came back, and I hadn't realized that I had taken my coat off. And he looked at me, and he said, oh, madam, I have a seat for you, and I have a berth for you. And I realized that he looked at the tapes, and he saw 5 tapes, and he thought I must be a general. Anyway, I was on the way home, and I went to say goodbye to Major Murphy, who's really been very wonderful to us. And when I went to say goodbye to him, he said, Sadie, it's time you went home. He said, I don't think that you realize that we knew what was going on with you guys in the Palestine Brigade, but we did. And he said, if you continued much longer doing that, you'd soon be caught, and goodness knows what would happen to you. So it was time for me to go home. Now, because we were officers, we were given a bottle of whiskey every month as a ration. And because I was going home to get married, the rest of the people on the unit gave me their ration. So here I was going to Calais with 12 bottles of, I mean, that was like gold, going home to get married with 12 bottles of whiskey. So I put it on, you weren't allowed to take it, so I put it on the counter and I said to the customs officer, look, I'm going home to get married. This is donations from my fellow workers, so either you let me take it or not. So he said to me, when are you going to get married? I said, in 5 days. He said, you look very tired to me. You better sleep for 4 of them. Anyway, he let me take the whiskey. But I was also carrying a far more precious possession. In November